Comenzamos. Buenos días, doctor Harris. Buenas tardes desde Andalucía, España. Bienvenido a la Academia Ceapro. Y es un gran placer para nosotros aprender sobre estratigrafía arqueológica con usted, el hombre que con la invención de una nueva metodología cambió la arqueología moderna. Muchas gracias. Bienvenido, doctor Harris, y gracias por estar aquí y aceptar nuestra invitación. Comenzaré con una introducción muy breve, aunque obviamente no es necesaria. Como podemos leer en el sitio web harrismatrix.com, el doctor Edward Harris es un arqueólogo natural de Bermuda, licenciado en antropología por la Universidad de Columbia de Nueva York en 1971 y doctorado por el University College de Londres en 1979. En 1973 creó el método Harris Matrix, realizando su primera aplicación sobre el terreno en la excavación de los restos de la puerta sur de la ciudad romana de Winchester en 1974.
Go away, I'm on a Zoom call.
Thank you. Tras la invención del método Harris Matrix, pudo convertir la noción de estratigrafía y su aplicación en arqueología en el tema de su tesis doctoral, realizada en la University College de Londres entre 1976 y 1978. La tesis fue publicada a finales de 1979 por Academic Press con el título Principios de estratigrafía arqueológica. Dicha obra ha sido traducida al italiano, español, francés, polaco, japonés, esloveno, alemán, húngaro, checo, árabe y chino, y está disponible para su descarga gratuita desde el sitio web harrismatrix.com y es editor y coautor del libro Prácticas de estratigrafía arqueológica, publicado en 1993. Ha recibido la excelentísima Orden del Imperio Británico, MBE, que recompensa las contribuciones a las artes y a las ciencias, y es miembro de la Sociedad de Anticuarios de Londres, FSA. Desde 1980 ha dirigido el Museo Marítimo de Bermuda, actual Museo Nacional de las Bermudas, del cual es actualmente su director emérito. Empezamos con la primera pregunta, si te parece. El 28 de febrero de 2023 se han cumplido 50 años del método Matrix Harris y nos gustaría conocer sobre los orígenes del mismo. En concreto, ¿qué idea fue la que dio inicio a la creación del método? ¿Qué fuentes bibliográficas o antecedentes utilizó? ¿Qué dificultades encontró en esos primeros momentos? Y si fue consciente, en la década de 1970, del alcance y repercusión que tendría el método Matrix Harris a nivel mundial en la arqueología.
Thank you very much. I will answer the first question by going through some of the slide presentation. Sorry about my voice. I don't know what's happened to it today. Can we go back to the first page? Very good. Well, as many of you will appreciate, the world is but a globe of stratification. Firstly, of course, is the geological stratification, upon which, as people we have overlain the globe in a huge pile of stratification made by people. This is perhaps the greatest revolution in geological stratigraphy, when people began to build cities and towns and to dig in the earth and to create their own stratification. So I did some years ago make a round stratification, because in the end, while we look at things in a straight up and down way, it's actually all circular, encircling the globe. We've made some enormous stratigraphic units, say, for example, the great American highway system, which goes for thousands of miles across the landscape, creating a new stratification everywhere. Next slide. Next slide. The development of stratigraphic ideas began, of course, in geology, and much of it may be attributed to James Hutton. And on the left, you'll see his profile, his famous profile, where he indicated strata that had been uplifted and turned, overlain by typical flat laid, horizontally laid stratification. And he considered that one of the most important aspects of this was the difference between the deposits, that is to say, the surfaces, which later people called unconformities. That is to say, this stratification lies unconforming to the strata below, indicating a change in the nature of deposition. This led to the concept of uniformitarianism, that what you see in the stratigraphic record today reflects what happened in the past. But from our point of view, the most important thing that Hutton brought to light was the importance of surfaces, and that the difference between deposits often occupied far more time than the actual laying down of the deposits. And this is a major factor that was overlooked by archaeologists, and a main reason why what we now call stratigraphic sequences could not be compiled. So we owe a debt to James Hutton. Now, in England, the evolution of stratigraphic thought is widely attributed to General Pitt Rivers, who had his own great estate with many archaeological sites, so he could dig in his own backyard. And he importantly produced good records of what he did, particularly in the nature of section drawings. As you see in his section drawing, along with James Hutton, generally speaking, there's no indication of definitive lines for surfaces. You're simply showing the physical depositions, which is what you can see, which is what you can dig, and the surfaces being immaterial are ignored. Next slide. There were, however, some archaeologists, earlier archaeologists, who appreciated or certainly recorded what they considered to be the surfaces, the difference between deposits. And there was a Reverend Joyce before Pitt General Pitt Rivers, who showed the surface lines in his sections clearly defined. This, of course, as you probably know, became a major battle later in archaeology as to whether you were supposed to just show the deposits or whether you should show the deposits and the surfaces. In the 1930s, and again, we're moving on rapidly, decades from Hutton, but the major revolution, in my opinion, occurred in the 1930s. It could have happened elsewhere. I can't say that I'm today representing a worldwide view of developments in stratigraphy, but I was raised in the British tradition, and one of the archaeologists who saw himself as the academic, if you will, descendant of General Pitt Rivers was Wheeler, Sir Mortimer Wheeler. Although time will eventually tell that his wife, Tessa, had a lot to do, perhaps, with some of these developments. But at Maiden Castle in Dorset, Wheeler did two things of importance. He drew surface lines in his sections, and more importantly, in a way, he individually numbered the deposits so that they had a unique identifying number to which the contained remains found in the deposits would be locked. This continued into the present day and was certainly the method used when I started to excavate at Winchester in the summer of 1967. Next. Wheeler also developed a method of excavation where the site was divided up into boxes with bulks in between. Now, in some ways, this was a practical matter because the bulks served to allow your wheelbarrow to come into the central areas of the dig and take out the excavated deposit material. Now, this became a method that was widely used until upset by what was called open area excavation. But in a way, it's neither here nor there. You can excavate a site in small areas or large areas. What's more important here is not the method of practically digging. Nowadays, for example, if I was digging a site like this, I'd have an overhead crane to take material, excavated material off the site. But the important thing here that became embedded in British archaeology was that the bulks contained the sections of the stratification, the profiles of the stratification. And the section became the icon of stratigraphic analysis. It's important to note here that the surfaces, by and large, were not recorded unless they appeared to represent a significant feature on the site, say a tessellated floor, a mosaic floor, something of significance. The surface would then be recorded. But to reiterate, this method of excavation is a bit of a sideshow. It's not the important thing about the advent or the advancement of stratigraphic analysis. Next. Now, when he published his textbook in 19 54, Archaeology from the Earth, Wheeler advocated, as was very much the practice, that you should not dig alongside the walls, removing the stratification in these areas from the stratification that ran up to the walls. So he was doing this because it was very much a practice at the time. You can say that the evolution of stratigraphic methods in archaeology advanced from a search for artifacts, so you destroyed the stratification to get the goodies, to an interest in the architectural features of a site, particularly urban sites. So walls became very important, and you destroyed the stratification without proper record to get at the walls. And I know this continued into the 1960s as I had occasion to look at the records of a site in America where all that appeared on the plan were the walls. And the excavator had precisely done this. They'd excavated all along the walls without record of the stratification that they removed. Well, as I indicate in the lower drawing, this is Wheeler, and this is my drawing. Wheeler's method of excavating in small trenches and not recording the surfaces did exactly this. You separated the stratification here from the stratification there by not recording the surfaces. And consequently, you were destroying a great deal of the stratigraphic information, and in most instances would make it impossible, as we later know, to compile a stratigraphic sequence. And a stratigraphic sequence is a diagram because it's a diagram of time. It is not the physical representation of the Earth any more than the Gregorian calendar shows you the sun coming up in the morning or going down in the evening, or winter passing into spring. So we ended up, if you will, by being caught by our own methods. We were diggers, and the important thing to do is to dig, and you can't dig surfaces, they're immaterial. You can only record them. So we became fascinated or stuck in the physical world of the deposits and sections, which only represented that. And I have a couple of quotes here. Incorrect excavation methods destroys the continuity. I would say incorrect recording methods destroyed the continuity. The site is excavated in a series of squares separated by bulks, which are left standing, these things here, which provide the keys to the stratification. Well, yes, they do if that's all you have. But remember that there could be deposits and surfaces appearing here, which don't appear in the section. Next slide. The problem, the problem with sections is that they are through a plane, a given plane on the site, a line across the site. And as we have to excavate from the top to the bottom, and we can't excavate sideways, you can never have enough sections ultimately to give you the full stratigraphic sequence of a site. So the question is, how do you connect the stratigraphic units here with the stratigraphic units here, or the stratigraphic units over here? And this is because sections are representations of the physical world in one dimension, depth. they're not stratigraphic sequences per se, because those are diagrams of time. You have to interpret the stratigraphic sequence from this physical world. And again, I bring my friend here, who is a good way. I'm sure all of you perhaps had some of the toys like this, but when you collapse the dinosaur, that is your stratification. When you let him stand up or let her stand up, that is your stratigraphic sequence, the difference between the two. Next slide. So in the 1960s and 70s, there were some archaeologists who appreciated that the method of using box trenches with lots of bulks across your site impeded the view of surfaces. And this is certainly the case in terms of Philip Barker, who became famous for developing what he called the open area excavation. And again, this is in a way, it's a bit of a diversion from matters of stratigraphy. It's more a question, if you open the site up, you can see more. And what do you see more of? You can see more of the surfaces of the topography of the site as you excavate. So if you're digging a site and you're only allowed one small area, that is your site. But if you have a larger area that you can open up completely, then you use temporary bulks so that the site topography is visible. And I compare it to the revolution in geology by William Strata Smith, who made this composite plan of the geology of England, which is very similar to this. And what he's showing is the parts of the stratification of the strata that appear on the surface at a given time. And of course, it's always a composite view because some deposits will be running under others, so only part of their surface will be on the surface at a given period. And so this is, in a way, the revolution that Barker was beginning to bring in, but it was emphasized more as a way of digging rather than a way of recording. And the important emphasis on surfaces for themselves had not yet come into being. Next. So when I was excavating at Winchester in 1970 and 71, I was fortunate to be able to excavate this area here of the Great Hall. And because this obviously was an important surface, it was recorded in this very meticulous way, which took a great deal of time, halted the excavations, and made a period plan, if you will, before the analysis of artifacts, before the completion of the excavations. And the problem with these plans is you can't take them apart. You can't recompose them. It is what you have after the end of the dig. And so I'm showing you the 5 major plans that were made for this site in the next couple of slides. So this was the first one, which you can see here. Next. So we went down through several construction periods for this site. So that was later. This is earlier. Next. And then we were in levels where the area was cultivated before the buildings were built. And underneath of that was a Roman building. Wonderful classic stratification, temporary bulks here, and so on. but all the surfaces in between these major surfaces, generally speaking, were not recorded. Next. So what the open area excavation method did was simply to begin to free the view you had of the excavated site as you were digging it down. So you got rid of these bulks. And by the way, much of the material in the bulks, after sections recorded, this material would be summarily removed. And again, the surfaces within it were simply not recorded. So the method of excavation was freeing your site to see it better, but it wasn't advancing the analysis of the stratification very much. Next. So I did a diagram to try and indicate the issue that we were having in the recording of stratification. So here is the Wheelerian box method, which ends up producing cubes of knowledge separated by the sections, a few selective plans. So you end up with cubes of stratification, the inside of which was not recorded. So that begins to be a bit corrected with open area excavation, but in the end, you just have complete sections and large composite plans. But you end up with more or less the same situation. Then finally, with open area excavation, when we went to recording all surfaces, it's an entirely different matter. And this is one of the major revolutions to come out of the Harris matrix. Next. So to say in geology or archaeology, the duality of stratification is very simple. It's erosion, accumulation, digging pits, making strata, or in the case of geology, volcanoes blowing up, accumulation, etc. But the point is, in terms of stratigraphic entities, you have deposits and surfaces, and that is it. We don't need anything more. There is nothing more. Next. And just as an aside, there are some archaeologists who still dig in arbitrary levels. Sometimes it's warranted if there's no discernible change in the deposit. And so you excavate in 10 centimeter spits or whatever you have. But if you excavate a site where it is clear there is stratification with surfaces, differences between strata, and you dig it arbitrarily, the main thing that happens, aside from the mixing of artifacts, is that you destroy surfaces before they can be recorded. And through all of this, surfaces are the key to stratigraphic analysis. Next. So I'm answering your question now as to how we came to the Harris matrix. But it's important to give you that background so that you have some understanding, at least for British context, of the evolution of digging philosophy, excavation philosophy, and recording methods. Now, the dig has finished, and you have a problem of what to do with the data, how to organize the data. And Kathleen Kenyon, I believe, may have been the first to publish a method that she called phasing. In other words, to arrange the stratigraphic data or group the individual units into phases or periods. of the development of the site. And she gave an example here in her book, but it was based upon sections. By the way, look at the bulks here where the information is missing. But anyway, it was based upon sections, and it was a verbal method of arranging the stratification into phases. So it was all written. When I came back to Winchester early in 1973, I was given a site to phase, to sort it out, as was then said. This was a case of some 70 site notebooks, hundreds of section drawings and plans, and you had to basically rewrite what was in the notebooks, but in phase or period order. And so at the time, diagrams like this one were being made. And you can see that this is going to be enough to drive you mad. And when you turn the page to the next phase, how can you remember what's underneath, what's on top of something? I mean, you can't know where you're going because the human brain is not large enough to do this on a verbal basis. And so I was working like this when I felt that I had to see where we were going stratigraphically. Next. And that led to an accident, which I consider to be an artistic epiphany. There were no great tomes that I'd been reading about stratigraphic methods. All I was doing was trying to find a way of seeing where I was going in this site, which eventually had at least 10,000 stratigraphic units. And so I was trying to straighten up one of those very messy drawings. And I had a piece of graphed metric paper underneath a clear piece of mylar, and I started making little rectangle spaces in between them. And when I made about this many, I knew that the world had changed. So I worked through the night, and this was the first pro forma sheet, which I in jest called the Harris matrix. In other words, it's a matrix, not as mathematical. It's something you could put the stratigraphic data into. And you will note here that it says layer chart, because again, one was still locked into deposits as being the important things on an archaeological site. So this was a layer chart. We now know it can represent the stratigraphic sequence of a site, no matter the size of the site. So from there, I began to work, and that's what took 5 years, I suppose, to figure out what we were doing wrong as archaeologists, because this became the old classic computer saying, garbage in, garbage out. Next. So the matrix represents the change in the paradigm of archaeological stratigraphy. I didn't know that at the time. You have to appreciate some of this is in hindsight. Change the paradigm from the one dimension of the section to the diagram, the four-dimensional diagram in a Harris matrix form. And it's 4 dimensions because each of these blocks represent a deposit, which has 3 dimensions, and the connections within them and between them is time. And so unlike an atomic model, for example, of DNA, which is held together by chemical matters, as it were, this is held together by time, with the earliest at the bottom and the latest at the top. And this has been acknowledged, particularly by Gavin Lucas in his book. For the first time, stratigraphy became truly independent of the section. And this was the key to the matter. And that true independence was based on the importance of the surface, not the section. Next. So having the matrix, I then started to put the whole of the Lower Brook Street site into the matrix format, which only took about 3 months, doing it in retrospect. But this diagram has about 10,000 units in it. Of course, many of the surfaces were not given numbers. Certain surfaces like pits or graves, foundation cuts, were given a number, so they figured into the sequence, but most surfaces were not recorded. So this site is under-recorded by probably 45 to 50%, if you will, at the time. One of the interesting things that became obvious is that, of course, your stratigraphic sequence gives you almost immediately an activity picture of the site. So Roman period here, not so much apparently happening in the Anglo-Saxon period. And then in the later post-medieval period, a huge development of this part of Winchester takes place. So these are various houses on the site. And so your stratigraphic sequence represents the flow of the evolution of the site simply by the number of units of stratification that exist for any particular period. Next. Now, the issue that I had, and better minds might be able to solve them in the future or using computers or whatever, but here we have the Anglo-Saxon period, and you can see that in the records, a number of units are completely unstratified, like this or that, or they're unstratified downwards or unstratified, on one of them, upwards. In other words, this whole area was excavated down into Roman deposits, but in the records, what happened below that.
Sí, exacto, dime. Sí, estoy en la clase, pero dime.
Sorry. Yes. Anyway, so the point is that these units lose their stratigraphic value because they're unstratified or unstratifiable, or they're unstratified in the records. When you use the Harris matrix, as you're digging, this does not happen, because every day that you dig and you remove a deposit, the unit is put into its position in the stratigraphic sequence. So the day you finish digging, the stratigraphic sequence should be finished. Next. So I then applied the matrix to this site of the Roman Southgate at Winchester, which I actually personally excavated along with Martin Biddle. So there are only two of us doing the excavations here. But this was just sort of pre-matrix in a way. So this is the stratigraphic sequence for it, made very close to the time of excavation. But again, only some of the surfaces were recorded. So the 400 units in here are again under-recorded significantly. But this is the stratigraphic sequence as opposed to the stratification either in plan or section form. And the method when it was born was true to begin with, and really only needs two rules to build your sequence. Things are either in superposition or they're not. I had a third one, which was an equate one, but you don't need to do that when you're building the primary sequence. Next. So I then went on with this because, of course, at the time I was thinking about where you go. You've made your stratigraphic sequence. What do you do with it? Well, instead of doing phases in verbal things, you divide based upon some evidence that you've got. You divide the or group the units of stratification into phases, and those phases can be represented in another matrix in stratigraphic order, which you can then divide or group into larger periods or phases called periods. And then you then can return to your topographical data and make up period plans which represent what was going on at the site at that time. But again, this was early days, and my realization of the total value of surfaces was not here, because these phases, instead of being 30, should be actually 60, because there should be phases of deposits and phases of surfaces. And that's not the case here, although it's sort of indicated in a way. So after the invention of the matrix, it took 3 or 4 years to stumble along. You hit various roadblocks. Next slide, please. Until we were able to come at a decent formulation of what should be done. We tried an experiment on a site that was being excavated in 1975. It was just a prehistoric ditch, and the person digging the ditch, Dr. Patrick Otway, or Patrick Otway at the time, agreed that he would record every surface before he excavated the deposit supporting it in a very simple diagram. All we wanted was a boundary with some spot heights. And this was the resulting set of drawings from which you could rebuild the site simply by overlaying the drawings and stacking them up, and you could see the evolution of the topography of the site. And of course, this is, as we now know, this is one of the most important aspects, because people live on surfaces, they don't live in the deposits. And the topography of a site, surfaces of a site, can survive for thousands of years, as you well know, in Spain, with all of the historic buildings, landscapes, and features that you have that were made many, many, many years or centuries ago, which are still in use today. Next. And just to point out that what we're aiming for is not this, which is what a composite plan used to look like, showing the boundaries. That's obviously there, but you want a contour plan, because that is what a surface really is. This is a surface. This is indicating the supporting strata underneath the surface. But you want a contour plan of the site, which represents the topography of the site when people were living on it or whatever. Next. And this became strikingly obvious in terms of surfaces when I did some excavations in the Highland New Guinea. And here is the site I worked on, and this site is nothing but surface features. Very little on top of it, practically no artifacts because of the nature of the culture there, but simply things cut into the bottom of the valley, representing houses and pits and various things like that. But that is it, is a one period site, a surface. The other thing about surfaces, and years ago I was playing with these little dots sort of overlaying things, but if you have a series of surface plans for your stratification, so you have one plate here, another one here, when you have them in stratigraphic order, you can't mix them up. You can't have a surface going underneath the other or anything like that. So surfaces have a way of ordering and allowing you, surface plans, allowing you to analyze the stratification during excavation and certainly absolutely post-excavation. And again, here on the right, in this little diagram that I made, the question is, am I representing the surfaces or the deposits? What is going on? What are we trying to achieve here? And in this case, I probably would say this is a series of surface plans, ignoring the stratification underneath. Next. So my eventual view was, can't see it because it's underneath here, our most important thing. Can you move that? Well, anyway, the stratigraphic sequence is the unifying entity on an archaeological dig. All your stratigraphic information of whatever sort feeds into your stratigraphic sequence, and that becomes the testing pattern for all later analysis. So on the right here is a bit of a stratigraphic sequence from a site at Carthage, and what Dr. Richard Rees did was he added in the dates of coins in the stratigraphic sequence. And you can see immediately that artifacts are unreliable. They have to be tested against the stratigraphic sequence. And if the chronology is not correct, so 530, 565, whoops, 540, oh dear, 530, and then on to 602. The stratigraphy is true. The explanation has to be made as to why the coins are chronologically out of date. So the stratigraphic sequence became the testing pattern, or is the testing pattern for all later analysis of archaeological sites. And that is why all archaeologists should know how to do it. And people working with archaeological sites, historic architecture or whatever, architects, whatever, should know the basics of a stratigraphic sequence and what it means and how to compile it. Next. So one of the other diagrams I did to indicate the unified world that is a stratigraphic sequence, I took a Wheelerian box and I drew the 4 sections individually, which is what was done at the time, but each has its own stratigraphic sequence, but they're all one section. This is all one section. It just happens to be in a square. And this is the true stratigraphic sequence of all of the units in these 4 sections. And it's the same for an archaeological site. You gel it down and you gel it down using the law of stratigraphic succession until you get your rarefied stratigraphic sequence of the site. Now, you must appreciate this is all after the fact of excavation. You can do this now on the site. You don't have to do it after the fact, which is what a lot of my research involved, because most of the record, well, all of the records were of the older era. And in order to make the stratigraphic sequence, we had to figure out what it was important in it, we had to make laws for archaeological stratigraphy, much to the annoyance of some geologists, but ours is a unique profession. And we should have, and now do have, our own scientific laws and methods so that we can make our unique contribution to the history of people on Earth. Next. Anyway, time ran on and I got diverted, but I ended up doing the little book, which you see behind me here, in a foreign language, you may recognize it. And the book was very expensive, and ultimately the publisher wouldn't produce a paperback, and they wouldn't reprint at one point. So we bought them out and put it on the website for free. And this is an old diagram from the first website, which was made by colleagues in Austria. Oh, yeah, I've been talking a long time. Better speed up. And so this shows the downloads, and you can see there are certain areas of the world where nobody seems to be using the book, but that's neither here nor there. Next. So it's now available in a number of languages and so on. Now, in wrapping up this little part, I just wanted to say my colleagues from Spain and Italy and Austria have been the outstanding people in support of the Harris matrix. And this diagram here was actually a schedule for the conference on the back of it. But when I saw these in a historic town in Spain, these were all stapled around electricity or telephone poles, Harris matrix, so the whole of the general public would come. Hopefully they didn't. Anyway, you have, as a nation, you've been incredibly supportive to what is now 50 years old and to an old man. Next. And it's passed in a way, oddly enough, it's passed into various things. It's appeared in several detective novels. My friend Andrew Richhold at Archeo Gaming took this picture from the movie and took off the white rabbit and put on the true matrix, as far as I'm concerned. This is on his website. Next. And could you tap that again? The song should come on. Just click it one more time. Oh, well, it's the song should come on. It's a movie. Never mind. Oh, there we go.
Info from a given site by using some standardized conventions to show their stratigraphic relations. We can see superimposition, projected relations between separate but equivalent deposits.
Can we try it again? There was pictures with it, but maybe not. You can see it it's on the internet. It's on YouTube. Next slide. Anyway, so there we are. Of course, a lot of people got annoyed with the suggestion that archaeology should have its own stratigraphic methods, but in the end, I think we've prevailed, and made a change that is absolutely vital for archaeology, because in many instances you could say, before understanding the role of the stratigraphic sequence in archaeology, we've simply dug a lot of sites and destroyed the history they contained. Next. Just a couple of slides. I was born on this little piece of rock in the middle of the northwestern Atlantic. It was discovered by a Spanish pilot, Juan de Bermudez. But fortunately, the Spanish were not interested in small places like Bermuda, or unfortunately, because otherwise I could be habla español today or something. But anyway, we're still speaking English. Next. So I returned home in 1979, and I was on my way to Australia, where I had had a good year sometime previously. And I took the job for a couple of years to run what was the Maritime Museum of Bermuda, including this house. 37 years later, next. So that was the house when I came there. It's almost in complete ruin. Next. So we managed to raise the money. This is a private exercise, not government. And we did things along the way. We got Columbia University School of Architecture in to put the building back onto paper. This is, of course, all surfaces. These are surfaces, surfaces, surfaces. Next. And things like this. The interior here, didn't know what to do with this room, so we painted the walls with a 500-year history of Bermuda, which is used for school children and so on. Next. And we did many other things. But one of the questions that was asked in the paper sent to me was, what did I think of Paul Corbin saying that the role of archaeology is the establishment of facts? I couldn't agree with that more. He was arguing against the new archaeology that was infesting the United States like a virus. And my view is the central responsibility of the archaeology establishment of stratigraphic facts in a stratigraphic sequence. If you can't do that, don't dig, go away. And of course, as we now know, this can be applied to all sorts of other things, artwork, all sorts of things. If you take apart a motorbike, you're doing a stratigraphic exercise. You have to take it apart in reverse order and put it back in the same order and so on. So thank you very much for listening. And we can do some questions. I realize I've talked for almost an hour, which I didn't intend to do, but there we are. I've given you my view, and it's not a criticism on what anybody did in the past. It's simply to say this is what they did do, and looking at it now, we would do it differently so that the contribution of archaeologists to human history can be more fully realized. We are a unique profession. We're not anthropologists, we're not biologists, we're not geologists. We don't have to be any of those things. You can do them also if you like. But if you're going to be an archaeologist, particularly one who excavates, your first job is to be an archaeologist, to apply those methods which are uniquely ours to recover the historic data of the material from a site that we are destroying. And that, of course, means that you must capture the stratigraphic sequence because that's the testing pattern. It's the unique DNA model for every site. And that's why we can compare them and why they're important. They're not all the same. If you excavate them in arbitrary spits, they're all the same everywhere. We have a unique role to do. A friend of mine, now deceased, who was buried with his trowel and his digging clothes, said that he considered that if society was a bulldozer, archaeology was on the cutting edge of the bucket, that we had contributions to make that no one else can make. And that has certainly been the case. But now we can do it in even greater detail because we have, through stratigraphic sequences for archaeological sites, that become the testing pattern for all the errant artifacts and ecofacts and all sorts of other things that you find in the deposits. And again, at the end of the day, surfaces can be entirely recorded, whereas deposits cannot. If we entirely recorded deposits and saved them, there'd be not enough museums in the entire world to take all the stuff we throw away, aside from the artifacts we collect. So yours is a very important profession, or any of you who work in allied field, which is, I showed you some of the museum work. We did all sorts of other things, underwater archaeology, fortifications, reconstruction of buildings and guns and so forth. All of it, to a degree, involves an understanding of stratification. But yours is a very important profession, and you're making a wonderful contribution, no matter what you may think, to human history. So I congratulate you, all of you, in your interest. And let's have some questions, and we can do that for as long as you like. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, doctor Harris. Muy interesante sus explicaciones de todo lo que es el inicio, cómo enfrentarse a esos más de 70 cuadernos, ¿no? Y esas más de 10.000 unidades estratigráficas, y cómo afrontarlo y aportar un conocimiento nuevo y una metodología nueva para la ciencia de la arqueología. Y para nosotros es un orgullo poder escucharle de primera mano y nos lo haya contado con esa facilidad y esa sencillez. Nos ha gustado mucho el ejemplo del juguete, ¿no? Del dinosaurio juguete, ¿no? Que explica muy bien quizás cómo pueden encontrarse los restos y cómo se puede llegar a reconstruir, ¿no? la secuencia. Teníamos varias preguntas. Una que puede ser interesante es ¿cuál cree que, en su opinión, que es la misión que deben de tener las administraciones públicas en la investigación, en la conservación, tutela y difusión del patrimonio cultural en general y del arqueológico en particular?
We're living in times where cultural patrimony is of increasing importance, although many authorities don't seem to appreciate its value for tourism as a basic economic driver. But it's important to understand principles of stratigraphy in any aspect of cultural patrimony, simply because much in the world is in some sort of stratigraphic order. And if you can learn to think stratigraphically, it changes the way you look at the world. You can see later windows added to a building, you see them pop out and get to their right place in the stratigraphic sequence. You can interpret things. Indeed, detectives, for example, on a scene of arson, where they're now starting to use the matrix and its methods, because of course, scenes like that are archaeological scenes, they're just not buried. So it's important to understand stratigraphic principles, and it's not difficult to do so. People do have difficulty with the notions because they are concepts of time, and many of us have problems with time. it's immaterial, it's invisible, and yet it exists. And as an archaeologist, you have three important time devices. You have the old-fashioned dial on the clock, which allows you to organize your day. I don't have it here, but you have the Gregorian calendar, which allows you to organize in sequential stratigraphic order, if you will, the days of the week, the days of the month, the weeks of the month, and the months of the year. And time, fortunately, was reduced to a calendar and to a clock face, which allows us to lead more orderly lives. So there are many, and of course, now you have the stratigraphic sequence, which is the major thing to come out of an archaeological site. And the important thing is, if you do this while you're digging, it's not a problem no matter how big the site is, because you can only excavate so much in a day. And at the end of each day, the person responsible for recording the surface and then excavating the deposit comes to the site hut or the computer and puts that unit, 2 units, surface and deposit, into their rightful place in the stratigraphic sequence. It's a no-brainer. Anybody can do it. And when you have new people coming to a site, you can take them to the site hut and say, here, this is where you are in the stratigraphic sequence, right here. And you're going to be digging underneath of that. So it's a tool to educate people who haven't been to the site, shows them the development of the site in reverse order, but simple to do. You don't really even need a computer for it. Now we do have PCs and so on, which I think has been a marvelous advance for archaeology because it allows us to shuffle data in a way we couldn't do it before. And now there are programs, of course, where you can feed in the stratigraphic data as you dig, and it will make the stratigraphic sequences illustrations for you.
Muchas gracias. Otra de las preguntas que hemos elaborado con los compañeros es, usted ha repetido en diversas ocasiones que la estratigrafía nos rodea. ¿Es posible, por tanto, aplicar el método Matrix-Harris a otras ciencias y disciplinas, como por ejemplo la restauración escultórica? ¿Cuáles han sido sus experiencias al respecto?
Yes, you can use the matrix for any entity that has stratigraphic content. If you take a sculpture and break it into pieces, you're uncreating a stratigraphic unit into several different units with new surfaces. For example, for some years, there was a notion that you could overturn archaeological stratification and therefore whatever, but it doesn't really happen in archaeology. It happens in geology, but in archaeology, if you overturn or remove strata and surfaces from one place, you're creating them in another. So rock art, for example, the matrix is now very much used in rock art in South Africa and Australia and other places, because when you look at wall paintings, rock art, they're in stratigraphic order. You can record them in a stratigraphic sequence and then use that for analysis of the site, if you will, and so on. So many people are applying it also to standing buildings. Very important, because in essence, there's no difference between a standing building or one that's lying flat in ruins under your feet and buried. So any entity that has layering, if you will, old paintings, wall paintings, whatever, you can use the Harris matrix on it. And people are expanding it in many ways. So it's it's a way of thinking stratigraphically. And you may think of other opportunities where you could use this. And what you're doing is giving yourself a way of keeping things in their correct order. And so that is the essence of it. And I believe it will be continued to use, and its methods, not its methods, but its uses will be expanded. And there is literature available online for sites such as Rock Art and so on. So it's very expandable and will continue to be used in other instances by archaeologists and other people. I would also say that, for example, if you give some radiocarbon dates to a laboratory, those should be accompanied by the stratigraphic sequence, an indication of where in the sequence those dates came from. In the past, you take a radiocarbon date and it becomes the sort of be-all and end-all. It's seldom tested against the stratigraphic sequence. So the point is that other professions should be aware of the nature of archaeological stratification if they're going to get more information out of their data and come to new conclusions.
¿Alguno queréis hacer alguna? Abro también el turno por si algún compañero o compañera quiere hacer alguna pregunta. Si no, pues otra de las cuestiones que nos gustaría saber su opinión es ¿qué consejo le daría tanto a los arqueólogos como a los conservadores de patrimonio en el control de las actividades arqueológicas? Es una de las labores que llevamos a cabo, en el que se controlan pues, las actividades arqueológicas realizadas en el ámbito de la comunidad autónoma.
And again, within communities where you're working on sites closely aligned to a community, again, it's very important to explain to people the nature of archaeological stratigraphy and how you get the information, how you're going to get the information about their community or ancestors out of an archaeological site, how you're going to expand their history by recovering this data. And again, it is very important for all practitioners, in my view, in the heritage field when it comes to anything to do with the landscape, buildings, and what have you, that they have a good understanding of stratigraphic methods in archaeology. It's our unique contribution to world culture, the recovery of information from archaeological sites, which are simply, no matter their complexity, by that I mean the number of stratigraphic units, that is our contribution to history. No one else can do it. It's as I mentioned earlier, it really is the greatest revolution. If no people existed anymore, it would be seen by the aliens as the greatest change in the nature of stratification on the globe, when roads and cities, graveyards, whatever, overlaid natural stratification put together by nature. So I would simply say we have a unique role to play, and it cannot be strongly enough emphasized that our role, particularly as archaeologists who excavate, is to recover the stratigraphic sequence, which includes all of the topographical evidence of the site, the surface of the site, so that the site can be reconstructed. Before the recording of all surfaces, most archaeological sites cannot be reconstructed topographically. And yet that has to be one of the most important aspects of patrimony, which is to be able to reconstruct landscapes. And that, of course, includes buildings, excavations in the earth, and so on. So a very important role that anyone in the heritage business is performing today, because it's so easy in the modern age, since the invention of the bulldozer and dynamite, to destroy the past without record.
Muchísimas gracias, doctor Harris. Está usted invitado a visitar España y en especial Andalucía cuando usted quiera. Será un placer para nosotros tener la oportunidad de recibirle aquí cuando así lo desee. Muchísimas gracias. Ha sido realmente un placer para nosotros escucharle y tener esta entrevista con usted y por su amabilidad. Muchas gracias.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. And as it's being recorded, particularly your students can go over things. And of course, if anybody has any questions later on, always open to try and answer them. And it keeps my old brain going. So I'm very grateful for any interest that is shown. No question is too small to consider. And I wish all of you the best in your continuing future. And it would be wonderful to see you all in person, perhaps in a year or two in Andalusia. Thank you all very much indeed. And thank you for listening to me go on at some length.